Well, good evening. I'm Heather Nicol, the director of the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. We respectfully acknowledge that we're on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga and Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and their teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to North at Trent. We have a very special guest speaker, but we also have a very special introducer to our guest speaker because tonight our guests are from University of Alaska Anchorage, and we've had a wonderful partnership with the University of Alaska Anchorage, and well, from University of Alaska Anchorage and from the Anchorage area. Jodie, I won't put you make you a biologist, but Doug will tell us a little more about our guest speaker. At this point, it's my privilege to welcome, to introduce our guest speaker, to Doug Causey. And Doug is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He's also an associate of the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Although he's way too modest to be associated with Harvard, but he is really a distinguished scientist, well known in the American community, Arctic community, and certainly in biological community of biological scientists. He's an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist by training. He's authored over 200 publications on topics as diverse as the ecology of the Arctic marine birds, high Arctic coastal systems, and what we love at Trent in particular is his bat research. He studies bat-borne disease ecology, among other things. He's published extensively on policy issues related to Arctic environmental security, Arctic One Health, and bioterrorism and public health. And Doug and I have done a little bit of collaboration together, certainly on some of the environmental security pieces. And he co-wrote a couple of chapters with me, and certainly in one publication. His current environmental research examines environmental correlates of climate change in Arctic, examines these correlates of climate change in the Arctic on birds and mammals and bats. I know they're mammals, but still, and bats. We love bats, and all our students that have gone to Alaska with me and have interacted with Doug in Anchorage have certainly been subject to wonderful discussions of bats, and we now think about them differently. He and his students are actively conducting research in the Aleutian Islands, the Northern Bering Sea. He really gets around. In Northwest Greenland, he's co-lead of the Coastal Environmental and Peoples Working Group of the NSF-funded Greenland and Ice Sheet Ocean GRISO Science Network. And that's just, we're just touching, the tip of the iceberg here. He's a wonderful colleague, a great friend, and I'm delighted to turn this over to Doug, who will introduce our guest speaker tonight.
Thank you, Heather. Wow, I sound pretty important, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, I'm here at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I have the great pleasure of introducing to you Jodie Anderson. Her research interests are in soil biochemistry with a focus on soil health and agricultural soils. Her training, and she has a BS in science education biology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and MAT, Master of Arts in Teaching and Science Education from Brown University. She taught chemistry and life sciences at high school and college levels for 11 years in North Carolina. Well, she got tired of being in what we call the lower 48 and moved to Alaska in 2003 to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I won't get you into the rivalry between the University of Alaska Anchorage and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but we're better. She came up to manage the Alaska Community Horticultural Program, particularly on research on the potato virus studies, and has been involved in citizen science projects, all aspects of agriculture and community gardening. Well, she currently is at the UAF Institute of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Extension Director. She's the director of the Alaska Agriculture and Forestry Experiment Station, which we call the Experimental Farm, and director of the Alaska Cooperative Extension Service. What is particularly notable about this is that very early on, and Jodie, you'll have to correct me on this, but I think even before Alaska was a state, there was the decision that it would be great if we could induce agriculture on a commercial scale to Alaska, and created an experimental farm, those are pretty typical, where you're looking at what strains of wheat or whatever would work best in the area that you're in. That work continues to the day, and the work that the experimental farm does is really helping develop a whole component of what we here call Made in Alaska. And this is produce, agriculture, all aspects of that grown, developed entirely here in Alaska. And even though the costs are a little bit more expensive than what's shipped up here, Alaskans prefer it by far. And so the work that the experimental farm does is so significant for our state. Well, the environment of Alaska is a little bit colder than where Trent is, but still we're talking about northern latitudes. And so the work that she and the staff at the experimental farm do are extremely important, not only for Alaskans, but for all of you. So with that, Jodie, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Doug. That was very kind of you. Hello, everybody. My name is Jodie Anderson. She, her are my pronouns. And thank you so much for inviting me to chat with you this evening and share with you a little bit about Alaska. I'm taking a rather broad scope vision of Alaska as and looking at our food system. And then we'll specifically look a little closer more on the production side, because that is my area of expertise. And talk some about the history of ag in Alaska, what's happening currently, and then where we're heading in our future, at least I hope that we head in the future. So there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, and I really appreciate everybody's time this evening. And I hope that this at least allows you to learn a little bit about things that you may not have known, see some things, hear some things, and then ask some questions at the end. That's where the fun really starts. So I hope you enjoy what I have to share. So we'll go ahead and get started. There we go. How's that? That's way better, isn't it? Perfect. There we go. First time Zoom user. Yay. Woohoo. Just kidding. Thank you for your patience. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the circumpolar food systems and really talking about what Alaska is about and where we are. And one of my favorite things to do in presentations is not have words, but have lots of pictures. And then we talk about the pictures and use those as our foundation for the conversation. So just a quick overview of what in the heck we're looking at in this opening slide. The picture on the left is one of my favorite gardening pictures, because that is what some of our gardens look like. This is a picture from Nome, and it's looking out south, and it's a beautiful summer day. And there's a lot of wind that comes across that tundra. You can see the tape. That is a greenhouse that they call it. The growers call that a greenhouse. That was a Costco garage shed that was purchased and put together, and then they use it for growing. It's a season extension concept, and it works really well. In the middle upper picture, this is a giant pumpkin. Alaska is known for growing giant vegetables, and at the state fair in Palmer, we have giant vegetable competitions and also giant pumpkin competitions that are registered with, they're certified and registered with, believe it or not, Guinness Book of World Records. So it's a big deal. And I'm a judge for that. I get to crawl around and feel for any holes on the pumpkin. It's a very big deal. I don't know if you're understanding the seriousness of this, but it's a really big deal. But this is one of my favorite pumpkins that we had. This was a few years ago. And I just want him to start talking to me. It just made me laugh, but it's a really big deal. We have a couple growers, and this is what they do, is they grow really, really big pumpkins. It's our sunlight, the length of day, that really contributes to our giant vegetables. Also breeding and crossbreeding into those lines helps a lot. The upper right hand picture is a picture of a reindeer herd in corral in the wintertime. And we'll talk a little bit more about reindeer in our conversation today. And it's fascinating what has been done in terms of the agriculture, the livestock that is reindeer. In the bottom left there's some old hay bales there. This is a picture that was taken in 1920. And this is taken in Palmer at our research station, as Doug mentioned. We are part of an experiment station network here in the state of Alaska. And this is the site where I'm located right now. It's got color now here, and it's not quite, well, it is just that dusty. So it looks almost the same today. This picture is a picture from 1977 in the almost same location. This gentleman is standing in the left-hand photo. This is a picture here. This is actually my cousin in Michigan who visited our experiment station in 1977. Farmers like to visit farms when they're on vacation, and my farm family came up to visit and came here to the station, and that is my cousin Lori, and a picture of a giant cabbage that was being grown here. Inside this next photo, this is a beautiful photo of a very large high tunnel that is in Bethel, Alaska. It is a remote location, and this is one of 3 high tunnels of this size. And this producer has found tremendous success using these high tunnels to grow produce and sell them to the community. And their greatest success they have found is strawberries. Believe it or not, they're actually growing 3 different layers of strawberries. Within that, they have them on the ground in raised beds. They have them on the sides as shelves, and they have them in baskets hanging from the ceiling. And they sell every strawberry they grow. It's quite lucrative. This last picture on the far right is one of my favorite shots about what farming looks like in Alaska. This was a project that was put in to the Galena State Fair. Galena is a small community of interior Alaska that is on the Yukon River. And it was a particularly cold year that year. And so this was a project, and if you can read, it says small scale farming. And believe it or not, all of the vegetables are truly, really true vegetables that she harvested for this. So you have little tiny Brussels sprouts, green beans that are about the size of a matchstick, and then other vegetables as well. It just cracked me up. And this is our perspective on small scale farming. So we do have good senses of humor, if nothing else. So welcome to Alaska agriculture. I do want to start us all on the same page because a lot of times there's vocabulary that let's next. Oops, where are you? Oh, no. Next. No. Okay, next. Next. There we go. Next. There it is. So what we do here is I'm gonna get rid of this, hide the panel. There it is. So a lot of times the word food security is thrown around a lot. And I don't like throwing that word around, even though it gets that's what most people are talking about. It's very difficult to define food security, and food security is oftentimes defined. You have 10 people in a room, you'll get 10 definitions, or maybe 12 definitions of food security. The really easy thing to do is talking about food in the larger picture as a system, because it is just that. The food system is complicated, it's complex, it's very it's so much more than just food security. So I like to refer to the food system when we're talking about any aspect of this work. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of the difference between kind of the Western food system model as the diagram in the upper left-hand corner. And you'll see that oftentimes these are, even though it's a cycle and it's a system and it's circular and one feeds the other, it almost always starts with food production on top and goes from production to processing to distribution, markets, consumption, and then waste, and then back to production. A few years ago, several of us who were working in the food system world in Alaska really started talking about Alaska has a different food system model. And we really need to acknowledge a critical piece that doesn't show up in the Western food model, the Western food system model. And that is the concept of wild foods. That is huge for us in Alaska. Regardless of your cultural background, whether you are indigenous or not, wild foods are part of the Alaskan food system. I would probably venture to say a majority of Alaskans have something in their home, in their freezers, in their pantries that was a wild food, whether it were berries and you made it into jams, you've frozen the berries in your freezer to use throughout the winter time, whether it's fish, salmon, halibut, cod, whether it's moose or caribou, or even other wild game. Alaska has a component of wild foods that are a really significant part of our food system. Everything else is also part, of the Western system. That still is part of it. But it's really critical that we acknowledge that wild food component. And so in Alaska, when we're talking about our food system, I like to make sure that we acknowledge the importance of the wild food component, and to understand that all of us eat food, so all of us are part of the food system. So instead of talking about food security and I can go to the grocery store and buy whatever I need attitude. Yep, I'm secure. Being part of the food system as a consumer allows the conversation. Now you're part of this. You're integral in this system. So we're all part of this system. So I really like to focus on using terminology like food system instead of using just food security. For tonight and for my specialty area, we'll talk a lot more about the production side. So that's the agricultural side of things that happen here in Alaska, but seeing how it fits in with the bigger picture and understanding that in Alaska, it's not all about production food. It's also about wild food, whether it's caught or harvested or gathered or picked, whatever verb is needed to get that wild food. They are very important to what we do. So here's a little perspective for you. I know most of you are in Canada right now, and those of you who aren't, who are part of UAF, I recognize some names and faces. You are aware of this, but Alaska is a really big place. As you can see here, to superimpose it on the lower 48, we like to call it, the 48 contiguous United States, your neighbors to the south, for my Canadian friends. I tried to find this map with us superimposed over Canada, and I could not find one. I'd love to see one. I'm not a GIS person, so I didn't have time to play with it, but I didn't find one. So the perspective is off for Canada, because Canada is a much bigger place than the lower 48. But just to give you perspective and to kind of see what we're dealing with when we talk about agriculture in Alaska. There is not one answer. When you talk about varieties, as Doug was mentioning before, a lot of the work that we've done in the past and we're continuing to do are variety trials at our farms. And when you talk about doing variety trials, I'm working, if you look at the very, very far southeast, you know, as far southeast, that is a temperate rainforest. Just to give you some knowledge, that is not the same biome. It's not even ecosystem, but the biome is different than where Doug and I live, which is considered South Central Alaska, around Anchorage. And if you can see my little cursor right in this area, so this whole kind of swath here is South Central Alaska. South Central Alaska is much more temperate than where my friends who are all in Fairbanks right now are sitting. Fairbanks is about 320 miles north of where I'm sitting right now, and it's a totally different biome than where we're sitting right now. That is strong boreal forest. It is intermittent permafrost areas. Depending on where you are, there could be more or less. We don't have quite that much down here in South Central, in most of our fields, if you will. So, and then when you look to the west of Alaska, our western area is much less forested, much more grasses and tundra, and some actually really beautiful soils, because you see those rivers that come out into the Bering Strait. So we have a really amazing state that covers huge areas. We should be 4 time zones long, and we're 1 actually, there's only two. There's a little bit on the Aleutians west is one time zone, and then the rest of Alaska is another. Fun fact why that happened, our state capital is in southeastern Alaska in that temperate rainforest. That was a different time zone than where the most people lived in Alaska, and to have your state capital and your population center different time zones was just crazy. So they made us all one time zone, which is pretty funny. So I want to start with, I appreciated the land acknowledgement, Heather. And I want to start with an acknowledgement of Indigenous agriculture. For millennia, the peoples of this land have, in my opinion, my definition of agriculture, have participated in agriculture. And the reason that I say this is because our Indigenous peoples have for years and years and years gone out and collected, but not collected all of a particular thing. Let's say they're picking berries or chocolate lilies, like the bottom picture. They're very knowledgeable about the land and about the animals and about the plants, that you don't go in and take everything and then wait for it to grow back, because that doesn't work that way. And so they truly were cultivating by selecting the good ones and left them to go to seed, to come back later and harvest some, but not all, to again leave a breeding stock to allow that. And so knowing that those berries are in that area and that they're the good ones were left behind, and a third of them were harvested for consumption and the rest were left so that there were enough to propagate for the following year and years to come. In my mind, that truly is agriculture. And so whether it was wildlife, whether it's fishes or plants, agriculture was happening. Selection, humans were selecting and leaving breeding stock in order to keep going and move that forward. So for your awareness, the beast that's sitting like a dog is not a dog. In the second picture down, that is a muskox. He was literally sitting like that. I don't know why, but he enjoyed sitting that way. I watched him for quite some time. Then he got up and he walked around a little bit more. The below is a fish rack, a very kind of a plain air fish rack. It was in the community of Koyukuk, which is over on the Norton Sound, which is over here on the West Coast. And I show you this map because, well, I find it incredibly beautiful. I love maps very, very much. This is one of my very favorite maps. And it is a language map of all of our different languages and our indigenous cultures. We're very rich with indigenous cultures, and acknowledging the agricultural practices that they have worked on and used since the beginning of time is very important to me as we talk about food systems in Alaska. And so anyway, I just wanted to share this and start the story at the very beginning where it should. And then we'll move ourselves into a little bit more into the times where we had silly men with mustaches standing in fields with almost 5 foot tall grains growing around them. This is, the tip of the hat to the history of the Western. Prior to this and these photos, Alaska had Westerners coming in as missionaries into communities. And in some of those communities, the missionaries brought gardening with them to those communities. And so those communities were able to, they had gardening introduced to them through the missionaries' work. Also, there were adventurers looking for gold. There were homesteaders coming up, and the pioneers who were looking for new lands. Most of them brought with them agriculture. Some brought livestock. Many brought seed stock with them. They started asking a lot of questions about what can grow in Alaska, what can't grow. In the summertime, do I have to milk my cow 3 times a day because it's light a lot longer than in the lower 48? So the United States Department of Agriculture sent up a team in the late 1890s and asked them to figure out if ag is worth doing in Alaska. The answer was yes, which then resulted in 8 different research stations being established across Alaska. The very first one was in Sitka, Alaska, down in southeast in that temperate rainforest that I mentioned. They started doing apple research. They were doing fruit tree research, figuring out what apples, what rootstock could be used to grow apples. And then across the state, there were these stations. Most of them lasted just a couple of years, but there were a couple stations that actually stuck. One of them was in Fairbanks, Alaska. And in Fairbanks, that station started in 1909, but the actual farm was built in 1911. That was a USDA farm, United States Department of Agriculture. And it was a research station. And they were helping homesteaders figure out how to grow food in Alaska. They were also there to see if it was worthwhile for the USDA to invest in Alaska and in agriculture up here. So they started doing research in Fairbanks at that farm. And in 1917, just to the east of that farm, the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines started. And that was the first university in the state. It became the University of Alaska in 1935. And then as that grew and Anchorage grew, it became the University of Alaska Fairbanks specifically. In 1917, it was decided that this area, the area where I'm sitting right now in South Central Alaska, had some really good opportunity for agriculture. Good soils. Yep, good soils. a population that was beginning to grow in a community just to the south of us called Anchorage. There was a train. There was a train. There were train tracks that were built that connected Anchorage to Fairbanks. And that was for freight and for tourists. Yes, tourists in 1917. And as that was finishing up, this land was part of the Alaska Railroad system, which at that time wasn't called the Alaska Railroad System, but that's what it was. The commission had this land, and this land was given to USDA for ag purposes. And so they started an experiment station here in 1917. In 1935, when the University of Alaska Fairbanks, or the University of Alaska Fairbanks started in Fairbanks, and was so named, it became the land grant University of Alaska. And in the United States, land grant universities are public universities that were funded by land being given to the university by the federal government in order to monetize the university for public education in agriculture and military sciences, believe it or not. So that's where we got started, and that's where we started. Our two farms have changed over time, and yet not also simultaneously. We continue to study what works and what doesn't work. We continue to work on Arctic and subarctic agricultural questions. We've gone through phases of livestock and no livestock and livestock and no livestock. We're just starting the livestock phase back up again. We're getting ready to start that again. It's really exciting. We have had varieties developed at our stations. We've had potatoes, I'll try to think, lots of vegetables, several types of grasses, a couple varieties, several varieties of wheat and of barley. Most of the barley is hulled, so it's feed barley. There has been some human consumption hull-less barley that's been developed. Fruits, strawberries and raspberries were developed at the farms. We figured out the right rootstocks, but didn't do a lot of breeding with apples per se. And then there's also been some landscape work, landscape trees, different larch varieties, tamarack or larch, and different things like that have been tested as well. In the early 30s, in the early 1930s, after the Great Depression and part of the United States New Deal, there was an opportunity for indigent farmers from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to apply to come to Alaska and start our agricultural community here in Palmer, Alaska. And it was called the Palmer Colony Project. And the community of Palmer was a depot. Actually, it was just where the train went through to get coal from the Talkeetna Mountains and take it into Anchorage for their energy production and their heat production. So we were just kind of a pass through. There really wasn't much of a community at all. And then in the 30s, the early 30s, they brought up 203 people in the colony project. The United States government brought them up, and the idea was, we'll give you land and you're going to farm it. And there was the beginning of a military presence in Anchorage, and we needed to feed the military. And so this is on the train route, so it made a lot of sense. Let's figure it out here. The soils were good, and the success of this station here in Palmer really drove that message home, that this is a location that will work for this colony idea. So it was called the Palmer Colony Project, and it wasn't really successful. It was like a lot of government projects where they had good intentions, but they kind of forgot to plan some things. There are still families here today who are direct descendants, and there are children of colonists who are here in Palmer. And it's really neat when we do historic presentations about the farm, and I show pictures like the very first one of the gentleman standing in the hayfield, and someone will tell me after the presentation, that was my dad's uncle, you know, or something. I'm like, wow, that's so cool. So we're really, actually, our history is very new. We're not old by any means in terms of kind of the timeline of things. But as Doug mentioned, I am a soil scientist, and so I do like to talk about soils in Alaska, and so I'll talk a little bit about those, which then will guide us into why we do what we do in Alaska and what is successful and what isn't successful. This is a 1983 soils survey map. Again, I didn't realize I was so map heavy, but I really love maps, as you can probably tell. We have 4 station locations across the state, and you'll see that the golden stars are our locations. The furthest south one is the location I'm located at now in Palmer, Alaska, and Doug is located just like right there. So this is Palmer. And then there's a road. You'll notice something about all of these. And we'll take this road north, and we'll hit our next star. That is Nenana. We have acreage in Nenana, and not a lot of research going on yet. It's a very new site. I think there's some really cool potential there for us to do ag research. I don't think it's a solid place for agriculture, at least not lots of soil intensive agriculture. And by that, I mean like potatoes are not going to be what you want to grow out there. Grains, probably okay. Then if we take the road from Nenana and we go to the farthest north star, that is our Fairbanks farm. And that is on the west side of campus, of our Trothyeta campus. And then as you take the road from Fairbanks and now go south, around the corner and head south, that's Delta Junction. Delta Junction was another agricultural project that was a statewide agricultural project. The Palmer Colony Project was a federal project, and it brought people from other states up here. The Delta Project was also, it did bring other farmers from other states up here, but it was run by the state of Alaska. And that project was called the Delta Barley Project. And in the 80s, it was decided that barley grew really well up here. And so what we needed is to grow more barley. So invite farmers who have some grain growing successes, bring them up here, give them land, allow them to grow barley, and things would go well. Unfortunately, there was no market for the barley. And so the farmers, are successful their first year, and they're like, we did it. Here, state of Alaska, here's our barley. And state of Alaska's like, okay, figure it out. Like, we don't, there was no market. There was nothing to do. There's not a train line that runs to Delta. And so getting the barley to a market was not even part of the infrastructure. So another bummer when it came to it. But this is where we're able to do our grains, a lot of our grains research. Just to give you some ideas about differences between just between Palmer and Fairbanks and Delta Junction. We will plant in Fairbanks in the springtime first. Most years, sometimes, not always. Delta will be probably close to the same day. And then there's Palmer. Recently, it's been Palmer by a week or so early. Then comes Fairbanks, then Delta. And then when we harvest, oftentimes it's Delta and then Fairbanks and then Palmer. Palmer is more temperate. We tend to have less sunshine. I don't mean like day length, which our day length is shorter than Fairbanks and Delta Junction is. However, we have more cloud cover, so we don't quite get the sunshine that Fairbanks and Delta Junction get. Delta Junction and Palmer both experience tremendous winds. So we have a lot of soil erosion issues, wind erosion. Fairbanks, our site in Fairbanks is very deep soils. They're excellent soils. As you can see on the soils map, you see the very dark colors, especially on the north of the Yukon River here. And there's dark green around Fairbanks and Nenana. There's no dark green down here in Palmer. Fairbanks has much deeper soils than we have. Palmer is much more recent glacial results of glaciation. And so our soils are really shallow. And here on the farm, I have fields that are 4 to 6 inches of topsoil. And under it is a glacial moraine, which is just rock. It's just cobbles and stones and pebbles right below it. So we don't have a huge water holding capacity. Whereas Fairbanks has very deep soils. And so there's a lot of moisture holding capacity opportunity in Fairbanks. So we get in the fields a little later, and we're doing all of our research as dry land farming. So we're not irrigating anything because our farmers tend to not irrigate in Alaska. And so because of that, we're not going to use methods in our research and then tell our farmers, hey, here's the best way to grow this thing. Oh, and also use methods that you're not used to using. We're not going to do that. So we know what our farmers are doing in the fields. And so we try to use those same processes as we do our research so that when we make recommendations, it's much easier for them to take that and apply it, as opposed to, great, now I have to buy a center pivot and dig a well. Thanks, UAF. So we don't have to worry about that so much. But our temperatures are much cooler in the summertime in Palmer than they are in Fairbanks and Delta Junction. They are much warmer in the wintertime. For example, right now here in Palmer, we have 0 snow cover, which is really frightening. We have had some warm weather, and we have rhubarb is beginning to erupt, as well as many other perennials people are starting to tell me about. Whereas in Fairbanks, there's lots of snow, a really nice insulation for our soil. So they're going to have a nice recharge of water after melt, after breakup. And they'll have that deep soil moisture that'll feed those crops all summer. We're not going to have any of those things down here. It's very difficult here in Palmer for us to grow a lot of our grains, but they're very successful in Fairbanks and in Delta Junction. So even within our state, we have in our 4 stations, we have very, very different growing conditions and soil types. So you're getting very different results. So the variety of broccoli that works really well in Fairbanks is not the variety that does really well in Palmer. So that's why we have different stations around the state. So because I'm a soil nerd, I had to geek out a little bit. Any chance I get to share soil pictures, I do. This is a profile shot. And of course, it's we have very young soils in Alaska. And it's hard for people to conceptualize that. But Alaska is a very young place in terms of kind of geologic scale and time. We have very young soils. And so you occasionally will see some nice horizon development like you do in this left picture. However, a lot of our soils are really, really young and not well differentiated. We have very high organic soils. We have very high levels of organic in our soils. And so, you know, when people start gardening or farming and they look at a soil survey or they get a soil test done and then they send it to extension, or, you know, if they know me, they'll ask me to do it because I love doing them. And they have, you know, 8% organic material in an ag soil. And they're like, should I put on more compost? I'm like, no, don't do it. Don't do it. You don't need more organics in your soil. You have plenty. Now it's using it up, right? Our soils are cold. I know, like, wow, that's magical, Jodie. Thanks. I'm so glad that I spent my evening listening to you tell us that soils in Alaska are cold. They are cold. And what happens in cold soils, even down here, where I don't really worry about permafrost in this area, but after a huge windstorm, you'll see trees that have blown over and their root balls are this deep. Even tree roots, when they get to a point where it doesn't have to be frozen soil, but it's cold, they start to just grow laterally. And so what you end up with is you end up with not root balls, but root mats. Even tap roots don't grow down very deep. And so cold is our issue. The cold soil is our issue. On the upper right picture, as you can see the ice below, kind of out of focus in that shot. This is a picture of glade soils. So this is super oxidized soils. And you can see it's starting to rust a little bit. It's starting to oxidize. So it's super reduced soils. It's really gray color because it's soaking wet because it's sitting on top of permafrost. And what's really cool, that's hard to see in that photo, but the root canals all had oxidized. So these bright red root canals, because that's where oxygen was, surrounded by these cold soils of like nearly frozen soils that were glade. So it was the steel gray color and these bright red veins that were the root canals of the root channels, really, of all of the little plants that were growing on the surface of the tundra. It was so cool. super nerd moment, like, yeah, soils. But this is a typical soil that's it's basically on top of a permafrost ledge or shelf. And the picture at the bottom is every good soil scientist has to have a picture of them with their butt in the air. So just sharing, that's what I do. So what sort of industries are up here? We've had industry. We've had agricultural industry in Alaska. And I mentioned reindeer on the very first picture. And reindeer is still an industry that's ongoing. It was originally brought, reindeer were not part of Alaska. They were not indigenous to Alaska. And they were brought into Alaska by a missionary from the Presbyterian Church, Sheldon Jackson. And it was in the late 1880s. And he wanted the indigenous populations to be able to eat and feed themselves because on the west coast of Alaska. And so he brought reindeer over, and we're like, here, we'll show them how to herd. That works. And at first it was a really bad idea because the people he brought with him with deer didn't get along with the indigenous population. They were indigenous to Russia, and they weren't happy, and it was a bad relationship. So that didn't work out. So let's try this again. Okay, yep, thanks, Sheldon, we'll try this again. So the next iteration was he brought Sami people. Sami are indigenous people to the Nordic region, and they're traditional reindeer herders. So the idea was, let's bring Sami people, Sami herders and their families and their deer to Western Alaska and bring them into communities and teach the Alaska indigenous people how to become reindeer herders. And so that's how reindeer herding started in Alaska. Then only Alaska Native could have female reindeer. And it was in the 1920s that there was a young man from Chicago who was up gold mining in Nome area, and he literally was very hungry. He was standing and mining or panning for gold, and he looked up, and there was this giant herd of reindeer standing there looking at him. He had no idea what to do because he didn't know anything about a reindeer herd, if they would attack him or stampede or what. And he started talking to folks, and he started talking to his family down in Chicago, and he realized that there was an opportunity to make some money on this meat. So as most stories do, it didn't really work out as well as he had hoped. But at one point, there was over almost 6.5 million. I know I have over 6 1/3, but it was almost 6.5 million pounds of meat, of reindeer meat, was exported out of Alaska into the lower 48 and sold, and it was very popular. It made a run for the beef industry. And after that, in the early 1930s, when the Depression hit, and the stock market crashed and no one had extra money to spend on fancy things like reindeer meat, this industry crashed. And the herds went from over 500,000 reindeer in Alaska to 30,000. And now there was the Reindeer Act, and now in Alaska, only Alaska natives can own these reindeer as livestock. You have to be Alaska native to herd reindeer legally in Alaska. And so this industry is starting to, it's always been there. There's always, they're predominantly on the Seward Peninsula, which is where Nome is located in northwestern Alaska. And it's still happening. We have people who are working with our herders now. This is third and fourth generation herders. And there's some success, and it's very exciting. And so several years ago, it was about 2008, there were a group of chefs in Denver, Colorado, who wanted to highlight reindeer because it's very low fat. It's delicious. The myofibrils in reindeer meat, in the muscle, so the muscle fibers, the actual muscle cells, are finer than caribou. And so it's very tender. It is delicious. I love reindeer. It's very good. And these chefs wanted to feature reindeer. And so they bought deer on the hoof from a herder on the Seward Peninsula, had them crated live to a slaughter facility here in Palmer that is certified USDA. The deer were slaughtered here, and then meat was packed, sent down to Denver, and then they turned them into very fancy dishes for very excellent prices for them, where the herders just were selling just the full off the hoof. And so this industry is starting to shift into a little bit more specialty, a little bit more opportunities for sales in specialty markets. And it's still around, and it's still happening, and it's improving, we hope. So what's happening in agriculture today? We have 1,000, you can read the numbers, but these are some of our largest statistics here. This is our USDA ag census data. So every 5 years, the United States Department of Agriculture sends a census out to all the farmers, and then these are the response data. So you can see here that we've had tremendous growth in the last many years. The really interesting thing to me is seeing this bottom statistic here about the farmers markets. We have these farmers markets don't include food hubs and farm stands. These are just official markets. We also have 20 other food stands and farm stands and food hubs that are happening in Alaska, in addition to these 66 farmers markets. And this is really where our agriculture is. More than half of our farmers are farming on land less than 9 acres. We are working currently in lots of season extension work. You can see this idea in the picture in the lower left-hand corner. This is actually at a school. This is in Tok, Alaska. It's their greenhouse there. It's fed, if you will, its heat source is waste heat from their biomass heater and furnace system. And they grow food for their whole school district there in this greenhouse that the kids run, which is really exciting. Grains are happening. These happen to be oats in this picture. They're grown as feed. Barley is definitely our #1 grain, successful grain. And we're also looking in the future. We are growing kernza very successfully in Fairbanks right now. Kernza is a thin wheat grass that's perennial. So you can cut it and then it comes back next year. It's good. It's doing very well. In fact, some of our research partners in North Dakota came to visit it last summer and are shocked at how well it's doing. We're also trying to look at different oil seed products. Canola does grow very well in Alaska, but we don't get it to drying harvestable seed. So it's still slightly green, which isn't good for canola. So we're working on camelina also in Fairbanks. It's warm enough and we've had 2 really exceptional summers. And so we've had some really excellent camelina results, which is exciting for our legislators as they look down the road at potential markets. Our largest agricultural export in Alaska is the peony. Yep. Peonies are our largest agricultural export. That was started at the University of Alaska Fairbanks by one of our horticulturalists who said at a meeting in Kansas City of a bunch of flower growers, when they were all complaining that peak bridal season in the lower 48 is after all the peonies are done. And our professor said, not Alaska peonies, that's when ours are just coming up. So we have a market. Now with the changes that are happening, even just in the last few years, our peonies are starting to blossom earlier and we're working ourselves out of that niche market. And that's kind of frightening. We do have a huge horticulture that's grown in Alaska. As you can imagine, our root crops grow very well here. All of the crucifers, broccolis and cauliflowers and cabbages and kales and then also we do have the giant cabbages too. We have potatoes grow very, very well here. We grow them, lots of leafy greens. And we're starting our new livestock research program here in Palmer that we're very excited about. We have a new researcher on board, and he is very interested in using Alaska grown products to serve as feed for our livestock, because shipping feed in is wicked expensive and we don't grow corn up here. So there's that. So looking at as we look to the future, we have a lot of opportunities. Our just in the 20 years I've been here in Alaska, I've seen a shift in temperature, length of summer, and we weren't growing wheat down here when I first moved here. And now we have a farmer who's growing about 38 acres of wheat successfully, and has for the last 3 years. So there is a shift, and that shift is going to create new opportunities for new plants and new growing systems. And that's what we're here for at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in our research. Our agricultural research is trying to figure out where we fit in and how we can prepare for all of these changes that are happening in the future. So here we are, a time for questions. I really appreciate everybody's patience with me, and I will go ahead and stop sharing because it would be most fun to not share anymore. And I could see everybody. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Jodie. That was really fascinating. I mean, we talked in the summer, and yet I learned so much more from talking to you or listening to you tonight. So, and I see, I think we probably have some questions. So now why don't we, let's see if I can get the view, how many, if I can get a gallery view. Well, we'll just see. Why don't we, maybe the best thing to do is to, rather than just jump right in, just to pop up your hand if you want. Okay, and Kathy, you've got a hand up.
Thanks very much, Jodie. I actually was curious. You said there's such a big group of people who are farming on 9 acres. And I mean, farming around where I am in south central Ontario, it's big machines and it's big fields and farmers who don't have, if they're doing crop farming, if they don't have 100, if they have 100-acre farm, which is sort of the standard in this area, then they have to rent fields to do cash cropping on other property that they don't own, but they're renting. So I'm thinking about volume, but I'm also thinking about machinery. Like how are people physically doing the cultivation and harvesting on 9 acres? Is it hand done? Are they kind of, are they using horse and plow? Like, I mean, smaller scale stuff that.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question. And I could say yes to all of those answers based on the, producers that I know. Very few of our producers are on 9 acres. That's the, between 1 and 9 acres is USDA's like first tier. Most of the ones that I'm aware of that are market growers are like looking at 2 acres. And the way that they work those is they're very intensive. They do crop rotation, like they'll have 3 different harvests of thing within their growing season. They'll do early spinach and then they'll cut it all out and then they'll plant something for that next go around. And then when that's all done, they'll plant even a 3rd time around. So it's very intensive. It's very diversified. It is, most of them are by hand. We don't have a trained labor force in Alaska for farm working. So it's neighborhood kids and family who get who get hired to do things. It is a lot of small scale machinery. There's like a walk behind tractor called a BCS. And it's kind of like a giant rototiller, but you can walk behind it. And it's great for, kind of that 1 acre, 2 acre. And this isn't, so if you can imagine 2 acres, but it's not a flat 2 acres of all vegetables. It's, it's a few beds of this and then a high tunnel, a couple low tunnel systems, and then a couple field rows, and then a border of cut flowers, and so it's very, very diversified. It's very different, and it's very hard to run. Like what you're talking about. And I'm originally from Michigan, and I know what you're talking about with the farms. It's all very tractor intensive. And you can't do that the way that these farms work up here. So a lot of people are doing it by hand on the small farms.
Super. I'm just scrolling up and down. Have we got Another question for, well, maybe while we're waiting, I'm just curious today about the extent of ag, university starts out as an ag kind of college. And what is the extent of agriculture? I know the work you're doing, the research you're doing, but what is the extent of agriculture as a sort of university subject? And are there still, no?
No, yeah. Interestingly, we've lost our College of Agriculture. We no longer have a School of Agriculture. We're a land grant university with no School of Ag. We're not, there's a couple of us that were, I think there's two in the United States that are like that. Agriculture in Alaska is really, it's really, it's not thought of. It doesn't look like the ag that you guys just described with the 100 acres and a tractor and the this. It doesn't look like that everywhere here. It looks like someone's backyard garden just grew like crazy and it's huge. And they just take the stuff to the market and sell it. So a lot of people don't see the agriculture happening. And because Alaska is such a heavy oil and gas and minerals extraction, natural resources extraction state, agriculture, it gets forgotten about. And so because of that, it becomes less and less critical in terms of the needs at the university level. So, as I'm trying to rebuild this, as I'm trying to rebuild our institute and our research enterprise and our outreach, and in all of those things, I'm also trying to kind of create a culture of agriculture and moving that forward simultaneously to eventually start building more of the academics that we need. So yeah, the easy answer is we don't have that at the university.
Okay. Now there's a question from Jessica Cook, and it's she says, I love how you started your presentation with discussing the Indigenous food history of the land. Is there much collaboration with Indigenous food systems and communities in the general Alaskan farming system, or any collaboration on wild growing harvesting methods that might be researched?
Oh, fascinating question, Jessica. Thank you. Let's see. So to answer your first question about Indigenous food systems in communities and general Alaska farming system, unfortunately, there hasn't been a whole lot. And the good news is that's changing. We now have tribes who are really pushing a more of a Western farming concept, and they're growing a lot of their own vegetables throughout the summertime to supplant their fishing in the fall time. We have large tribal groups, so kind of regional tribal groups who have hired agricultural specialists, and they're doing indigenous agriculture, or they're doing agriculture, which is really cool. And so that's beginning to happen. And as there's more success with our indigenous leaders and our indigenous communities, then others are like, oh, we could do that. Hey, we could do that. We have a very active food policy council that's across the state of Alaska. And that food policy council works really hard bringing all the players together and not just the farmers, which generally aren't our indigenous folk. So there's the Alaska Farmers Market Association, and that has really crossed over into the indigenous agriculture communities, way more so than kind of that traditional farm bureau group that's your normal, you know, you kind of your old-fashioned farmers, if you will. So it's starting to happen more, and I'm really excited because there is success and there are collaborations, and we are reaching out and saying, can you help us figure this thing out? And they're reaching out and saying, can you help us figure this out? So we are working across the way, which is great, finally. And in terms of wild food growing and harvesting methods being researched, there's ethnobotany that is a course opportunity. It's a certificate program at one of our remote campuses in Bethel, Alaska. It's through that at UAF. And there's not a research hasn't really crossed into that line very much yet. I think that's a little more scary than the ag component than the research side of the traditional things. That being said, I when I was director here at this farm, I worked with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. They have a hospital. It's huge. There's a hospital in Anchorage, and all of our indigenous people can go to that hospital for medical care across the state. And they had their executive chef believed that healing began with how you ate and what you ate. And so she used to say, there's no green jello in my hospital. And she's right. And so she would have indigenous food at the hospital and always had fish head soup, always. So any elder at anyone who wanted fish head soup could have that. And even our folks that have dental problems can consume that. And that's where there's remembrance, there's home, there's healing in those foods. So she and I have worked together a lot on projects, and she has brought several of her folk out here to the farm, and they've done, we call it that we let them become weed, because in our definition, a lot of the plants that they're looking for are our weeds. And so they're looking for lamb's quarter, and they're looking for yarrow, and they're looking for, a wild chamomile, a pineapple weed, all of those sort of things. When they walk around, they're just like, whoa, and they see medicine and they see healing, and we're just like, yeah, you can have all those weeds, we don't care. So they would come out and harvest on site. And we also would grow, we're still growing Tlingit and Haida potatoes. And then we grow about 100 plants of each year. And then they come out and they harvest it. Like, she brings her chefs out and they all harvest them. And then they use those potatoes that are important to Southeast tribes in their Thanksgiving meal. So it's just really, there's those opportunities that we're doing. And then there's also some just really cool things that are happening with several different tribes across the state.
Super. Well, thank you, Jodie. I think I don't see, I think we're on our last question, and we've just come to time. So I want to thank you so much for your presentation this evening. It's wonderful. And you remind, I'm a geographer, so this is just great. You reminded me of why I enjoy geography, the maps and understanding. I mean, you have to start with the soil, right, to understand how all of the system works. And I love it because we sometimes when we talk about the North and the circumpolar world, we we zero in on certain topics and we totally ignore others. And of course, you know, this is how people survive. It's tourism, it's the, as you said, the country foods, the hunting and gathering, and then tourism, excuse me. It's agriculture and country foods and hunting and gathering. Tourism is our next talk. I'm going to raise that in a second. But and it's just, you know, the day-to-day things that really make life possible in Alaska, and the kind of work you're doing is fascinating. We just don't hear enough of it. So I want to thank you so much for your talk tonight. It was fascinating, and to say to folks that are here, and invite you, Jodie, and folks from Fairbanks as well, and Anchorage who are on the call, or anybody who's interested, that our next talk will be February 24th, and we'll be talking with folks from Adventure Canada, which is we're looking at tourism in the way that you talk about agriculture. You know, really the context and the importance and the interlinkages. I want to thank you so much for sort of starting us on this adventure in 2025, you know, of really trying to understand, you know, the backbone of economies and way people live, and the interconnections between, you know, settler and indigenous systems in the north. So thank you very, very much, and thank you all who were on the call today. Lots of great comments. You know, this is awesome. Everybody appreciated the talk. So, and thank you, Kathy, for your intrepid management of all of this, and you know, facilitating the Zoom for us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to come. And the next one looks pretty exciting. So
yeah, well, come with us. Yes. Oh yes, there we are. Expedition cruising in the Canadian Arctic, and we'll get you there for that. And Jodie, we'll see you this summer, I think, when this spring when some of us are up.
awesome. That'll be great.
Okay.
I look forward to it. Thank you, everyone.
you.
Be well.
Thank you, everybody.